When the last kings of Ur fell, they left behind more than toppled ziggurats and abandoned ledgers. They left a vacuum one that hummed with opportunity. In Mesopotamia, the end of an empire was never quiet. It was a kind of creative destruction, scattering pieces of administration, religion, and ambition like seeds across the floodplains. And among those seeds was a place that would soon grow into Babylon. At first, Babylon wasn't even a capital. It was a small provincial town tucked between greater cities, Kishnipur and Isin, each vying to become the next center of gravity after Ur's collapse. The soil was rich, the water nearby, and the people pragmatic. They built canals that glimmered under the sun, patched their brick walls after each flood, and learned to survive the pendulum swing between drought and plenty that defined Mesopotamian life. The early 2nd millennium BCE was a time when the map of the Near East seemed to rewrite itself every decade. Amorite tribes, the so-called Westerners, migrated in waves from Syria and the Levant, slipping into the power structures of older cities. They didn't crash through the gates as barbarian invaders. They walked through the front doors as merchants, mercenaries, and eventually kings. The Amorites were quick learners. They adopted Sumerian writing, Akkadian language, and local deities with ease, blending desert toughness with urban sophistication. In Babylon, one Amorite chieftain saw potential where others saw only dust and canal water. His name was Sumu-Abum, and around 1894 BCE, he proclaimed himself king. No royal bloodline, no ancient mandate, just audacity, timing, and an instinct for survival. That single decision marked the official birth of Babylon's first dynasty. Sumu-Abum's rule was modest by later standards. There were no grand palaces, no sweeping conquests. But there was something far more important: independence. For the first time, Babylon was ruled from Babylon. Under him and his successors, Sumu-La-El, Sabium, Apil-Sin, and eventually Sin-Muballit, the city began to find its voice. The Amorite rulers didn't try to reinvent civilization. They recycled it. They took the administrative systems perfected by the Sumerians and the Akkadians and made them their own. Taxes, trade records, temple rations, all written in cuneiform on small clay tablets. The language of power was still Akkadian, but the pulse behind it was new, pragmatic, adaptable Semitic. Babylon was becoming bilingual in every sense, linguistically, culturally, and spiritually. Its location made it irresistible to ambition. The city sat at a crossroads of trade routes, linking the Persian Gulf with the lands of Syria and Anatolia. To the east lay Elam and its mineral wealth. To the north, the rising power of Assur. To the south, the fertile plains of Sumer, still echoing with memory. Every merchant passing through left a little wealth behind and a little gossip, which in the ancient world was often more valuable than silver. Sumu-Abum's successors understood this geography, like gamblers understand odds. They expanded slowly, carefully, fortifying canals and negotiating alliances. Where force was too expensive, they used marriages and treaties. They fought skirmishes with nearby city-states, Larsa Eshnuna and Isin. But the goal was not conquest yet. It was credibility. And then there was Marduk. At first, he was just a local god, one among hundreds in the Mesopotamian pantheon. His temple was small, his worshippers few. But the Amorite kings saw in him something useful, a divine patron they could elevate without offending the old order. Other cities had their mighty gods: Enlil, in Nippur Shamash, in Sippar, Inanna, in Uruk. Babylon needed its own divine signature. And so Marduk began his climb up the celestial hierarchy, one royal inscription at a time. The strategy worked. As Babylon grew, so did the mythology around it. Each victory, each new canal, each harvest surplus was credited to Marduk's favor. The city and the god became inseparable two halves of a rising identity. When future kings built temples or enacted laws, they would claim to do so in Marduk's name, turning religion into both glue and weapon. By the time of Sin-Muballit, around 1812, BCE Babylon was no longer a sleepy outpost. Its scribes were busy, its granaries full, and its walls taller. The city's administrative system rivaled that of any in the region. The markets along the canals sold wool grain and metals. Boats crowded the docks, their sails striped with bright dyes. Within the palace compound, scribes sat cross-legged before tablets, copying records in the dry heat, as reed styluses clicked like insects. Still, Babylon remained in the shadow of larger powers. To the south, Larsa, under the formidable Rimsin, dominated the trade of the lower Euphrates. To the north and east, Eshnunna and Mari watched every move with suspicion. Babylon's kings were clever, but they were cautious. They knew that empire required patience. The Amorite dynasties of Mesopotamia existed in a delicate balance, each city watching the others for signs of weakness. Yet beneath this surface equilibrium, something new was forming, a shared identity that blended the languages, laws, and myths of Sumer and Akkad into something distinctly Babylonian. And into this evolving world, into a city already primed for greatness, was born a prince whose name would become synonymous with law, justice, and empire. His name was Hammurabi, son of Sin-Muballit. And with him, Babylon would step out of the shadows and seize history by the throat. Babylon's story, until now, had been one of patience, a city biding its time, while stronger neighbors fought, fell, and forgot. By the dawn of the 18th century BCE, that patience was about to pay off. The first Amorite kings had built foundations of stability, diplomacy, and faith. Now those foundations were ready to carry something far larger in identity. When Hammurabi's father, Sin-Muballit, grew old, the city was poised like a drawn bow. Trade with steady walls were sound, and the name of Marduk was beginning to stir beyond the city's borders. Still, Babylon was not yet an empire. It was one among many city-states vying for influence, Isin Larsa, Mari, Eshnunna, each with its own gods, its own bureaucracy, and its own ambitions. Then came Hammurabi. He inherited the throne around 1792 BCE, young, unproven, and surrounded by rivals who underestimated him. His kingdom was respectable, but modest, a cluster of fertile fields, loyal towns, and priests who whispered that Marduk watched favorably over the city. Hammurabi's first act was not conquest, but organization. He strengthened irrigation canals, repaired temples, and refined taxation. He ruled as if preparing for an exam he knew was coming. He wasn't wrong. To the south, Rimsin of Larsa dominated the old Sumerian heartland. To the northeast, Eshnunna controlled trade routes and metals. To the west, the wealthy city of Mari commanded the Euphrates corridor. And lurking beyond the horizon were the Elamites, always ready to cross the border with a polite smile and an armed escort. Hammurabi's genius was timing. For the first 20 years of his reign, he fought almost no wars. Instead, he watched his neighbors. He signed treaties, sent envoys, exchanged letters, written in elegant Akkadian. To the outside world, Babylon seemed docile, even harmless, a minor power content, to mind its canals and its gods. But Hammurabi was studying the board. He knew that Mesopotamian politics was a cycle. When one city grew too strong, its rivals would unite against it. When it fell, alliances dissolved. Hammurabi waited for that cycle to turn. It did spectacularly. When Elam invaded Eshnunna, the region erupted into chaos. Hammurabi, ever the opportunist, formed alliances with Mari and Elam to counter Larsa's influence. Then once his allies were spent, he turned on them too. One by one, the city-states fell. Larsa conquered, Eshnunna subdued, Mari burned. Within a single generation, Hammurabi had done what no one, since Sargon of Akkad, had achieved unified Mesopotamia under one rule. Babylon was no longer a city among cities. It was the center. But Hammurabi's ambition went beyond military power. He wanted legitimacy, the moral and divine authority that made kingship more than conquest. For that, he needed a symbol strong enough to outlast him. Enter the Code of Hammurabi, a tall black stele of basalt, nearly 8 feet high, inscribed with 282 laws, the first comprehensive legal code we know by name. It was both law and theater, a declaration that justice flowed from the king, who in turn received it from the gods. At the top, carved in relief, Hammurabi stands before Shamash, the sun god of justice, receiving the rod and ring of authority. Beneath them, column after column of cuneiform text rules for property trade, marriage wages, theft injury, and punishment. The famous eye for an eye appears here, but it was never quite the blunt rule we imagine. The code was hierarchical, carefully balanced according to social class. Harming a nobleman might cost you your life. Harming a slave, a fine of silver. It was harsh, but logical, a mirror of a world obsessed with order. In a society where rivers could flood overnight and kings could vanish by spearpoint law, was a form of comfort, a promise that the universe, at least on paper, made sense. And through it all, one divine name kept recurring: Marduk. Hammurabi's political victories were impressive, but his cultural revolution was subtle and profound. By elevating Marduk to the status of supreme god, the Lord who had given him victory and law, Hammurabi reshaped the very hierarchy of heaven. The old gods still existed, but they now served Marduk, just as the cities of Mesopotamia now served Babylon. It was theology as imperial propaganda. Marduk's temple, the Esagila, became the spiritual heart of the new empire. Priests copied hymns that praised him as king of the gods. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish would later crystallize this idea. Marduk slays the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat, creates the world from her remains, and builds humanity to serve the divine order, an unmistakable parallel to Babylon's political dominance over a chaotic land. In Marduk's rise, Babylon found its myth. In Hammurabi's code, it found its conscience. And in Hammurabi himself, it found its legend. By the time of his death, around 1750 BCE, Babylon was no longer a name whispered in trade routes. It was the capital of civilization. Its walls gleamed with baked brick, its archives overflowed with tablets, and its laws stood as both monument and warning. But empire, as always, is a fragile kind of immortality. Hammurabi's heirs would inherit his greatness and the impossible burden of maintaining it. When Hammurabi climbed to the throne of Babylon, he inherited not a kingdom of marble and glory, but one of mud memory and precarious alliances. Babylon was strong enough to command respect, but small enough to be stepped on by its neighbors if it miscalculated. It sat at the center of a chessboard already crowded with kings, and every piece on that board had sharper teeth than Babylon did. The young king's first challenge, then, was not conquest, it was credibility. He ruled a city that was rich in ambition, but light on pedigree. The old Sumerian dynasties could trace their lines back to myth itself. Hammurabi's ancestors were Amorites newcomers from the western deserts who had learned civilization the way one learns a second language fluently, but with an accent. He had to prove that Babylon belonged not only on the map, but in history. And so, he began the slow, deliberate work of empire building: one irrigation canal, one decree, one divine favor at a time. His early reign was cautious. Instead of marching armies, he sent surveyors. Instead of erecting statues of himself, he reinforced the city's walls. He reopened the ancient canal systems left behind by the kings of Ur, ensuring that grain flowed, ships moved, and the gods had no reason to complain about neglected waters. In Mesopotamia, good irrigation was not just good policy, it was proof of divine favor. He invested in temples too. Not only those of Marduk, his city's rising patron, but the sanctuaries of other gods throughout his territory. Each temple repaired was a handshake extended to a rival city, a subtle reminder that Babylon was a friend, not a threat. At least not yet. Meanwhile, he studied the region's politics with almost forensic patience. To the south, Rim-Sin of Larsa ruled a prosperous kingdom that controlled the rich farmlands near the Gulf. To the north lay Mari, a glittering city of palaces and archives, and beyond that, Assyria, not yet imperial, but restless as ever. To the east, the mountain kingdom of Elam lurked like a thundercloud. Each of these powers could at any moment decide to test Babylon's defenses. Hammurabi did what all good politicians do when surrounded by stronger players. He smiled, he bargained, and he waited for them to make mistakes. For nearly 2 decades, Babylon's armies stayed close to home. Hammurabi was building something subtler than conquest legitimacy. He standardized measurements and taxes, expanded the bureaucracy, and codified the rituals of kingship that linked him to both the divine and the legal order. In a world where divine right was everything, image was power. He portrayed himself as the chosen of Marduk, the humble shepherd of his people, the judge who would protect the weak from the strong. It was propaganda, but it was good propaganda, and it worked. By the 1760s, BCE cracks were forming in the old power balance. Larsa, after decades of dominance, had grown complacent. Its long-lived king Rim-Sin was aging, and his once great alliances were dissolving. Eshnunna, to the northeast, had been weakened by wars with Elam and Mari. Though wealthy, was divided by its own court intrigues. Hammurabi sensed the shift. He began to move carefully at first, then with precision. He struck agreements with Mari and Elam, framing them as partnerships of mutual defense, but quietly using them to isolate Larsa. Then, with his alliances secured, he launched his first major campaign. Babylonian armies marched south, their banners bearing Marduk's emblem, a symbol of divine justice that now looked very much like a declaration of war. The campaign was swift and devastating. Larsa fell around 1763 BCE, and with it, Hammurabi inherited the legacy of Sumer itself, the old capitals of Ur and Uruk, the temples of Enlil and Inanna, the sacred cities of the south. In one move, he became not just a conqueror, but a restorer of civilization. But Hammurabi was far from finished. Once Larsa's fields and temples were under Babylon's flag, he turned his attention to his former allies. Eshnunna, weakened, but still proud, became the next target. Then Mari, whose king, Zimri-Lim, had once toasted Hammurabi as a brother king. Babylon's friendship had served its purpose. Now it served as a prelude to conquest. Mari's fall was infamous. The great palace, a masterpiece of Bronze Age architecture, was looted and burned. Thousands of clay tablets, letters, and accounts were buried in the ash, waiting 3,500 years to tell archaeologists how the world ended for them. The destruction was both practical and theatrical, a message to every rival city that Babylon was no longer an upstart, but a destiny. By the time the wars ended, Hammurabi's empire stretched from the mountains of Elam to the sands of the western deserts, from Assyria's edge to the marshlands of the Gulf. For the first time in centuries, all of southern Mesopotamia spoke with one voice: his. And yet what made Hammurabi different from earlier conquerors was that he didn't just want territory. He wanted structure. He wanted his empire to run without him, having to stand in every court, oversee every tax, or arbitrate every quarrel. He wanted a system that could survive his death, an almost revolutionary thought in the Bronze Age. So he turned his attention inward to the concept of law. Not divine whim, not palace decree, but a written standardized code that all could see. A code that would make justice predictable and rulership stable. In carving his laws onto stone, Hammurabi wasn't just controlling his people. He was teaching them how to think like Babylonians. The Code of Hammurabi would become his monument, far greater than his wars and far more enduring than his palace walls. And yet, for all its grandeur, the seeds of Babylon's decline were already buried within it: the cost of empire, the strain of centralization, and the dangers of a legacy too large for any heir to sustain. But that reckoning was still to come. For now, Hammurabi stood triumphant, king of kings, chosen of Marduk, architect of an empire that had turned dust into destiny. If empires are stories written in blood and stone, Hammurabi's was written in clay and on one monumental slab of black basalt that would outlive his city, his dynasty, and even his language. The wars were over. Babylon now stood astride Mesopotamia like a patient giant. But victory was only half the equation. The real challenge was how to hold it all together. Hammurabi understood that an empire of 100 cities couldn't be ruled by swords alone. Swords rust, generals rebel, and soldiers are expensive. What doesn't rust is law. A system of rules that everyone could recognize, from a temple priest in Nippur to a farmer near Larsa. That was power of another kind. So sometime around 1754 BCE, he commissioned a statement so ambitious that it redefined what it meant to be a king. The result was the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a basalt stele taller than a man, covered from top to bottom with 6,000 lines of cuneiform text. It began not with law, but with theater, a prologue in which Hammurabi presents himself as the humble servant of the gods chosen by Shamash, the god of justice, to bring order to the world. The relief carved at the top shows the sun god handing the king a rod and a ring, symbols of measurement and authority, as if to say, rule, but rule justly. Below that divine tableau came the laws themselves, 282 of them, organized with the meticulousness of a scribe and the subtlety of a politician. There were laws about irrigation, what to do if your neighbor's poorly maintained canal floods your fields. Laws about trade, how to handle debt's interest and broken contracts. Laws about marriage and inheritance, about builders, brewers, shepherds, and surgeons. Every detail of daily life was covered. What strikes the modern reader is the precision and the hierarchy. Babylonian justice was proportional, not equal. If a nobleman struck another nobleman and broke his own bone would be broken in return. If he struck a slave, a fine would suffice. Justice was calibrated by class, gender, and circumstance. Cruel, yes, but logical within a world where order mattered more than mercy. At its heart was the principle we still recognize today, that the strong should not harm the weak. Hammurabi's prologue even says it outright, that the gods appointed him to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. It was an aspiration as much as a law, a statement that power could, at least in theory, serve fairness. But Hammurabi was not naive. He knew the code was also propaganda. The towering stele stood in public view, meant to awe citizens and intimidate rivals. Most Babylonians couldn't read it, but that hardly mattered. The image of divine authority carved into stone was as potent as any speech. It declared that Babylon was not only the center of trade and religion, it was now the center of justice. The scribes multiplied copies of the laws on clay tablets and distributed them to provincial governors. Bureaucracy spread like river water. Disputes that once relied on the whims of local rulers were now standardized. Contracts referenced the code by number. Merchants cited it in arguments. It was in its own way a bureaucratic revolution, the first attempt to make law impersonally consistent. Yet the laws were also deeply human. They reveal a society obsessed with fairness and terrified of chaos. If a builder's house collapsed and killed its owner, the builder was to be executed. If a doctor's patient died during surgery, the doctor's hands could be cut off. Harsh, yes, but beneath the severity lay a desperate desire for accountability, a world where actions had consequences even for those in power. Religion, too, was woven into every clause. Temples were not just places of worship, but hubs of administration and finance. Offerings, loans, and contracts were often overseen by priests who acted as bankers and notaries. To disobey the law was to defy the divine order, a crime against Marduk himself. Hammurabi's rule thus bound heaven and earth into a single bureaucracy. Beyond Babylon's walls, this vision of cosmic justice became a diplomatic tool. The code was copied and admired in distant cities. Foreign rulers referenced it in correspondence. It turned Hammurabi into something more than a conqueror, a lawgiver, the archetype of the wise king. Centuries later, when scribes in Assyria and Persia wrote their own decrees, they would model their formulas on his. But behind the monument's serene logic, the machinery of empire strained. Hammurabi's unification of Mesopotamia had come at enormous cost. Soldiers' taxes forced labor resentment. The ink on the laws was barely dry when rebellions began flickering in the provinces. The canals that symbolized prosperity also became fault lines. Whoever controlled the water controlled life. Managing such a vast system required constant vigilance and a bureaucracy that ate its own weight in grain. Hammurabi himself spent his final years not as a conquering hero, but as a manager of crises, reorganizing governors, quelling revolts, repairing walls after floods. Even so, the image of the just king endured. When he died around 1750 BCE, Babylon stood as the richest, most orderly city in the world, its ziggurats gleaming under the sun, its scribes recording everything from lawsuits to omens of the stars. Yet within a generation, his empire began to crack. The unity he had forged through charisma and code would not survive the ordinary failings of human succession. Still, the idea he created that justice could be written down, preserved, and applied would outlive his city by millennia. From the tablets of Mesopotamia to the halls of modern courts, the shadow of Hammurabi's stele still stretches across the human imagination. But for Babylon itself, a harder season was coming. Kings would falter, enemies would gather, and the empire of law would soon learn how fragile law can be when power slips from the hand that wrote it. The empire Hammurabi built glittered with the confidence of permanence canals, flowing tablets, stacked temples, humming with the rituals of order. But permanence is a myth civilizations tell themselves when they've run out of threats to fear. The ink on the code of Hammurabi had barely dried when the old gods of instability stirred again, rebellion, famine, and the relentless entropy of empire. When Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, he left his son Samsu-Iluna, a kingdom that looked strong on parchment but trembled in its foundations. The vast territories that had once bowed to Babylon's power were restless. Conquered cities like Larsa and Eshnunna had sworn loyalty out of fear, not devotion. The old Amorite nobility grumbled about taxes. Farther south, the marshlands near the Persian Gulf seethed with local rulers who preferred mud and autonomy to Babylonian law. Samsu-Iluna was not his father. Few could be. He inherited an empire that depended entirely on the charisma of the dead. The bureaucrats still recorded everything: crop yields, rations, debts, but loyalty cannot be measured in tablets. Within a few years of his accession, the southern cities rose in revolt. Uruk-Isin and Ur, once jewels of Sumer, declared independence. They remembered Hammurabi as a conqueror, not a savior. The new king's response was brutal and inevitable. Babylonian armies marched south, torched rebel cities, and crushed the resistance. The destruction of Uruk was so complete that it never regained its old prominence. The message was clear: disobedience would be erased, not negotiated. But punishment is expensive. Maintaining an army large enough to suppress 100 restive provinces drained the treasury. The empire was hemorrhaging silver and men. Meanwhile, new enemies were arriving from directions Babylon had barely noticed. From the marshes to the southeast came a mysterious faction, later known as the Sealand Dynasty, a loose confederation of local chiefs, traders, and canal men who knew the waterways better than any army. They controlled the delta and the ports to the Gulf, choking Babylon's access to foreign trade. Their swampy homeland was a nightmare for conventional warfare, a labyrinth of reeds, water, and loyal insurgents. To the north and east, other powers began to stir. Eshnunna briefly re-emerged, and the ever-opportunistic Elamites launched raids across the frontier. Even Assyria, still a minor state, began flexing muscles it hadn't yet realized were imperial. Samsu-Iluna fought back heroically, but without vision. He spent decades chasing ghosts, one rebellion suppressed only for another to rise behind him. He strengthened Babylon's defenses, repaired temples, and tried to keep the economy afloat. Yet the administrative brilliance of Hammurabi's generation was gone. The machinery of the state still turned, but it produced friction rather than prosperity. By the end of Samsu-Iluna's long reign, Babylon's empire had shrunk dramatically. The south was effectively lost to the Sealand rulers, who established their own dynasty independent of Babylon's authority. The great cities of Sumer, once the heart of Mesopotamian civilization, became provincial backwaters. Even the northern provinces began slipping away, governed in name by Babylon, but in reality by local elites. The kings who followed Abi-Yeshu, Amiditana, Amisaduqa, and finally Samsu-Ditana, each faced the same impossible equation: too little power, too many enemies, too few loyal subjects. They turned inward, emphasizing religion and ritual as a substitute for control. Babylon's priests thrived. Its bureaucracy survived. But the empire was a shadow of its former self. There were, however, flickers of light amid the decline. Amisaduqa, for instance, left behind astronomical records so precise that modern historians use them to date ancient eclipses. Babylonian priests were beginning to notice patterns in the heavens' early steps toward a science that would one day shape calendars and astrology alike. Even as the empire faltered, the intellectual pulse of Babylon persisted. But history has a cruel rhythm. Cultural brilliance often peaks just before political collapse. Around 1595 BCE, from the north came a people almost unknown to Babylon, the Hittites, an Indo-European power rising in Anatolia. Led by Mursili I, they marched down the Euphrates in a daring campaign that caught everyone off guard. Babylon's walls, long considered unassailable, fell with shocking ease. The Hittites looted the city, seized its treasures, and most sacrilegious of all, plundered the temples of Marduk. Then, as suddenly as they came, they left. It was not conquest, but a raid, a swift surgical strike that shattered the illusion of Babylon's invincibility. The city's last Amorite king, Samsu-Ditana, vanished into history. The dynasty that Hammurabi had made eternal lasted barely a century after his death. In the chaotic aftermath, Babylon became a prize for whoever was bold enough to claim it. The Kassites' highland people from the Zagros Mountains began to move in first as mercenaries, then as rulers. They would bring a long peace, but for now, the city lay silent. The fall of Hammurabi's dynasty is more than a footnote in ancient politics. It's a parable of empire. Laws and walls can endure only as long as the people who believe in them. Babylon's greatness had been built on faith in the king, in the law, in the favor of Marduk. And once that faith cracked, even the strongest bricks turned to dust. Out of the wreckage of Hammurabi's fallen world, a new people quietly stepped into history, neither conquerors in the classic sense, nor natives of the land they would soon rule. They came not from the plains or the great rivers, but from the mountains to the east, from the rugged ridges of the Zagros. The world would know them as the Kassites, and for 4 centuries they would rule Babylon longer than any dynasty before or after. Yet few today remember their names. If Hammurabi's empire was fire and ambition, the Kassite era was ash and rebuilding slow, steady, and astonishingly durable. It began not with triumph, but with exhaustion. After the Hittite raid around 1595, BCE Babylon was left leaderless. The temples were plundered, the walls breached the idol of Marduk, carried off as spoils. Rival city-states jostled for control, and the southern Sealand dynasty still held sway over the marshes. The once proud capital of Mesopotamia had become an open wound. Into that vacuum walked the Kassites. They were outsiders, a highland people who had long served as mercenaries and administrators in Mesopotamian courts. For generations they had learned the local languages, worshipped the local gods, and married into local families. When the old order crumbled, they didn't invade, they absorbed. Bit by bit, through a mixture of diplomacy, opportunism, and quiet persistence, they took Babylon for themselves. By the early 16th century BCE, a Kassite king named Agum-Send, often called Agum-Kakrime, had consolidated power. His reign marked the start of a remarkable project, the restoration of Babylon's dignity. One of his first acts was symbolic but profound. He recovered the stolen statue of Marduk and returned it to the Esagila temple. In the theology of Mesopotamia, that act was nothing short of resurrection. The return of Marduk meant the gods had forgiven the city. Order could begin again. The Kassites were clever in how they presented themselves. They did not claim to be conquerors or foreigners. They spoke the Akkadian language in official inscriptions and adopted Babylonian royal titles. They honored the old gods and preserved the ancient rituals. Their message was simple: Babylon lives. In many ways, their reign was the opposite of Hammurabi's. The Kassite kings rarely fought grand wars. They didn't build empires of conquest. They built empires of administration. They restored canals, reestablished trade routes, and standardized taxation. Provincial governors reported directly to the capital, and land was recorded meticulously on clay tablets. The result was a kind of bureaucratic peace, not glorious, but stable, the way a well-balanced ledger is stable. One of their most intriguing inventions was the kuduru, or boundary stone. These beautifully carved limestone markers recorded royal land grants, often to soldiers, priests, or loyal officials, and invoked terrifying divine curses upon anyone who might dare to alter them. Each kuduru was part legal document, part magical talisman engraved with the emblems of gods: the crescent of Sin, the lightning fork of Adad, the spade of Marduk. In their artistry, we see a fusion of Kassite practicality and Babylonian mysticism. Economically, Babylon recovered. The fields of the Euphrates were irrigated again, granaries filled, and trade revived. Caravans moved westward toward the Levant and Anatolia, while ships from the Persian Gulf carried goods to Dilmun and beyond. The Kassites encouraged contact with distant powers, the Hittites, the Mitanni, the Assyrians, even Egypt. Indeed, the Kassite era was Babylon's diplomatic renaissance. The famous Amarna letters clay tablets, discovered in Egypt recording correspondence between Near Eastern kings in the 14th century BCE, include several from Kassite rulers. In them, the kings of Babylon address Pharaoh Akhenaten as brother, a title reserved only for equals. They exchange gold horses, lapis lazuli, and lavish gifts. The tone is formal, but friendly, a fraternity of monarchs maintaining what scholars now call the Great Powers Club of the Late Bronze Age. For a people once dismissed as mountain mercenaries, the Kassites had achieved the ultimate transformation from outsiders to peers of the world's mightiest rulers. Culturally, their rule was conservative but enduring. They didn't innovate like the Sumerians or legislate like Hammurabi. Instead, they preserved. Scribes continued to copy older texts in Sumerian and Akkadian hymns, myths, medical treatises, omens. The Kassite kings understood that their legitimacy depended on continuity. They saw themselves as caretakers of civilization rather than its authors. In temples and palaces, old knowledge was not merely remembered, it was recopied, standardized, and archived. This quiet devotion to preservation may explain why so much of Mesopotamian culture survived the turbulent centuries that followed. Without the Kassites, Babylon's written tradition might have vanished altogether. Their long reign was not without conflict. Border skirmishes flared with Assyria and Elam, and there were moments when Babylon's pride outpaced its strength. But the Kassites proved remarkably resilient. They could lose a battle and still keep the peace. They could be invaded and still retain control of the core lands. For more than 400 years, they kept Babylon's heart beating not through conquest, but through the stubborn rhythm of good governance. By the late 13th century BCE, however, time was catching up with them. The world around Babylon was changing. The Hittite Empire was faltering, the Mitanni were gone, and Assyria was awakening into an empire far more aggressive than before. Meanwhile, the distant thunder from the Iranian highlands, the Elamites, was growing louder. The Kassite kings had maintained balance for centuries, but every balance eventually tips. Their dynasty would end, as so many do not, in rebellion from within, but in invasion from without. Yet before the storm came, Babylon enjoyed one of its longest seasons of peace, a rare century in which a Mesopotamian city could believe that stability, rather than conquest, was the natural order of things. It was a peace built by outsiders who became natives by kings who ruled not through brilliance, but through patience. In a world addicted to rise and fall, the Kassites' quiet rule stands as the rarest of miracles, an empire that endured by being ordinary. By the 14th century, BCE Babylon had traded its armor for parchment. The roaring conquest of Hammurabi was long gone. In its place stood a quieter empire that ruled by pen seal and signature. The Kassite kings had stabilized Mesopotamia so thoroughly that diplomacy, once the art of surviving one's neighbors, became an art form in itself. Babylon was now a full member of what historians call the Late Bronze Age international system, a loose fraternity of kings who considered themselves the civilized elite of the known world. These monarchs called each other brother. The title wasn't sentimental, it was bureaucratic. To be addressed as brother by the Pharaoh of Egypt, the great king of Hatti, or the ruler of Mitanni, was to be recognized as an equal. Beneath the politeness was calculation. Every exchange of gold or horses was a small act of power balancing. And Babylon, under its Kassite rulers, played the game with elegance. The proof lies in a trove of sun-baked clay, found far from the Tigris and Euphrates at Amarna in Egypt. These were the Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between the great powers of the 14th century BCE. Among them are several tablets written by Babylonian kings to the Egyptian court, composed in polished Akkadian, which by this time had become the international language of diplomacy, the Bronze Age equivalent of English or French. The tone of these letters is both formal and faintly comic to modern eyes. One Babylonian king writes to Pharaoh Akhenaten, complaining politely but pointedly that the gold Egypt promised has arrived in disappointing quantity. Another requests a princess in marriage, a true royal daughter, not a concubine in disguise to cement brotherly friendship. A third letter scolds an envoy for returning home empty-handed, accusing the Egyptians of stinginess unbecoming to a great king. Beneath the polite haggling ran a complex web of alliances. Gifts of lapis lazuli horses, ivory and textiles moved between capitals as symbols of goodwill, but they also functioned as political insurance. To exchange gifts was to acknowledge one another's sovereignty. To withhold them was to signal disapproval. In this careful dance of diplomacy, Babylon stood as a middleweight, never the most powerful, but always indispensable. Its strategic location helped. Sitting at the crossroads of East and West Babylon, connected the resource-rich highlands of Iran with the Mediterranean trade world. Caravans carried copper, tin, and wool through its gates. Barges floated grain and timber down the Euphrates. Scribes recorded every shipment on neat rows of clay tablets. The Kassite administration thrived on paperwork. Each delivery, each tax, each diplomatic gift was logged, sealed, and archived, a bureaucracy so meticulous that a single error could trigger days of debate in the palace halls. Even religion became international policy. The Kassite kings carefully honored the deities of neighboring lands, sending votive gifts to distant temples and accepting foreign gods into Babylon's pantheon. The philosophy was simple: if every god might help, why risk offending any Marduk remained supreme. But his divine court expanded with every new treaty. The result was a cosmopolitan theology that mirrored the diplomacy of its kings. This interconnected world produced something unprecedented, a sense of shared civilization stretching from the Nile to the Zagros. Scribes from Hattusa to Thebes learned Akkadian. Royal archives everywhere stored tablets from Babylonian workshops. Even foreign myths began to borrow Mesopotamian imagery, flood stories, divine councils, cosmic battles. Babylon's cultural gravity was immense, pulling the Near East into a single orbit of ideas. Yet behind the polished etiquette and golden gifts, the system was fraying. Communication took months. Mistranslations bred suspicion. Trade routes were vulnerable to every drought and bandit. The Kassite kings could correspond with pharaohs as equals, but they could not control the tectonic shifts of the age, the slow rise of Assyria in the north, the restless ambitions of Elam in the east, and the exhaustion of the great powers themselves. Still, for 2 centuries, this balance held. It was a golden equilibrium in which words mattered more than wars. Babylon's envoys dined in foreign courts. Its scribes taught the children of kings. Its gods were invoked in oaths sworn thousands of miles away. The city that had once been hammered into obedience by Hammurabi now ruled the world's imagination through language, law, and the art of correspondence. It was diplomacy, as empire a kingdom maintained not by armies, but by archives. And like all elegant systems, it depended on stability that could never last. Beyond the polite letters and carved seals, storms were gathering in the east. The Elamites were watching, and the long patient reign of the Kassites was entering its twilight. By the end of the 13th century, BCE, Babylon's long Kassite peace began to tremble like an old ziggurat settling into the sand. For 4 centuries, these mountain-born rulers had done the impossible. They had kept Mesopotamia calm. But empires rarely die in a single moment. They unravel thread by thread, so slowly that even their kings mistake the sound of collapse for the hum of continuity. The signs came quietly at first. Trade routes that had once pulsed with caravans grew thinner. Taxes arrived, late then lighter. Governors wrote longer and longer reports to explain shorter and shorter harvests. In the royal archives, scribes still carved optimistic formulae. The land is well, the gods are pleased, but their careful repetitive lines feel like the whistling of men marching into fog. Part of the problem was geography. The Kassite dynasty had lasted precisely because it was conservative. They kept Babylon safe and bureaucratic while the outside world evolved. But by 1200 BCE, that world was changing violently. Across the Near East, whole civilizations were beginning to shudder. The Hittite Empire to the northwest was weakening under internal strain. In Syria, cities were burning. Mysterious sea raiders haunted the coasts, and distant Egypt fought a desperate rearguard against them. Assyria, meanwhile, no longer content with polite diplomacy, was sharpening its ambitions into iron. In this unstable climate, the Kassites faced a new old enemy, Elam. For centuries, Babylon and Elam had traded and occasionally fought, but now the Highland Kingdom was ascendant under a fierce line of rulers determined to avenge old humiliations. The Elamite king, Shutruk-Nakhunte, marched westward with an army that moved like a storm through the lowlands. His campaign was devastating, not just for its scale, but for its symbolism. Around 1155 BCE, the Elamites captured Babylon itself. They looted the temples, stripped the palace walls, and carted off the city's greatest treasure, the golden statue of Marduk, Babylon's divine protector. In a culture where the god's physical image embodied his presence, this was more than theft. It was cosmic humiliation proof that Marduk had abandoned his people. The Kassite king, Enlil-nadin-Ahi, was dragged away in chains, perhaps to die in an Elamite prison. After 400 years, the Kassite dynasty was finished. The Elamites didn't stay. Like so many conquerors of Babylon, they came to plunder, not to govern. Their army withdrew eastward, leaving behind a smoking capital and a shattered political landscape. In the ruins, local warlords and surviving Kassite officials scrambled to fill the void. Out of this chaos rose a patchwork of small kingdoms, the so-called Second Sealand dynasty in the southern marshes, and a new Esan dynasty in central Mesopotamia. None could claim more than a fragment of the old unity. Babylon entered what modern historians call a dark age, not because it was forgotten, but because the record itself grows thin. The scribes who had once chronicled every shipment of grain now had other concerns like survival. The canals silted, the grand temple festivals faltered. Yet remarkably, the idea of Babylon endured. Even stripped of its god, the city's name still carried a weight that could legitimize whoever ruled from its throne. Every new dynasty that appeared in the centuries to come would proclaim itself the restorer of Marduk's favor. The Kassites, for their part, did not vanish entirely. They retreated into the highlands and borderlands where their descendants lingered as provincial administrators, mercenaries, and small kings. To later Babylonians, they were remembered not as conquerors, but as caretakers, a dynasty that had kept the lamps of civilization burning when the world outside was cold. Still, something fundamental had changed. The quiet, steady rhythm of Kassite Babylon, its diplomacy, its land, grants its brotherhood of kings, belonged to the Bronze Age, and that age was ending. Trade collapsed, literacy declined, and empires everywhere turned to dust. The gods themselves seemed to retreat, leaving mortals to rebuild what they could from memory. When the smoke cleared, Babylon would re-emerge, but it would be a different city, hungrier, more defiant, forged by invasion and loss. The centuries ahead would pit it against a new rival to the north, a restless kingdom whose soldiers were disciplined, its ambitions limitless, and its patience terrible. Babylon had survived Elam's plunder, but soon it would meet an empire that preferred possession to pillage. The centuries after the fall of the Kassites were years of ghosts. Babylon remained, but it was a survivor of itself, scarred, proud, and uncertain of what future still belonged to it. The temples were rebuilt, yes, but the hymns sounded hollow. The scribes wrote, but mostly about the past. For the first time in its long history, Babylon was no longer the heart of Mesopotamia. That title was shifting northward toward a younger, hungrier kingdom that had learned its craft from the Old South and now meant to surpass it. The name of that kingdom was Assyria. Assyria had always been there, tucked along the upper Tigris River, a sibling of Babylon, stern and pragmatic, where Babylon was poetic and urbane. Its capital cities, Ashur and later Nineveh, were smaller than Babylon, but more disciplined, less romantic, and infinitely more militarized. While Babylon traded in laws and theology, Assyria specialized in logistics and war. Over centuries, it had quietly perfected both. The new Assyrian kings were not content to be regional powers. By the 13th century BCE, they were carving out the world's first truly systematic empire, built on an army that marched like a machine and a bureaucracy that treated conquered peoples as resources rather than trophies. And inevitably, their gaze turned south. Babylon, for all its ruin, was still Babylon, a name that carried divine legitimacy, a city of temples and archives, a symbol of culture that even conquerors hesitated to destroy outright. To control Babylon was to control civilization's narrative, to crown oneself, not just king, but heir to history itself. The Assyrians understood this perfectly. Their first attempts at influence were subtle. Rather than outright invasion, early Assyrian kings placed friendly rulers on Babylon's throne, loyal allies, whose loyalty, of course, was measured by tribute. These puppet kings paid in silver grain and slaves, while Babylon's priesthood performed ceremonies that conveniently affirmed Assyria's divine favor. The Assyrians ruled from a far content to let Babylon call itself free, so long as it remembered who its elder brother was. But freedom and vassalage make uneasy neighbors. Among Babylon's scribes and priests, resentment simmered. The city's pride ran deeper than its rivers, and its people viewed the northern kings as upstarts, foreigners who understood conquest but not civilization. To the Babylonians, the Assyrians were muscle without soul. To the Assyrians, the Babylonians were intellect without discipline. Each saw in the other a mirror distorted by contempt. It was Tukulti-Ninurta, an Assyrian king of terrifying energy who shattered the illusion of coexistence. Around 1225 BCE, he marched his armies south, seized Babylon, and for the first time in history placed an Assyrian crown upon the Babylonian throne. His inscriptions boast that he captured the city with the support of Ashur and the great gods, but his victory carried a curse. In a move that would haunt his legacy, Tukulti-Ninurta plundered the temples and carried off the statue of Marduk to his own capital. To Babylon, this was sacrilege beyond measure. The king of the gods was in exile, taken by a foreigner who claimed divine sanction. The priesthood's outrage spread like fire through clay. Even in Assyria, the act shocked many an unthinkable violation of Mesopotamia's spiritual order. A king might conquer cities, but he was not supposed to humiliate the gods. Tukulti-Ninurta soon discovered that even emperors have limits. His reign ended violently assassinated amid rebellion, perhaps seen as divine punishment for his arrogance. In the century that followed, Babylon clawed back some measure of independence. Local kings returned, rebuilt temples, and performed the sacred Akitu New Year festival once more. The city's resilience was uncanny. Like a reed in floodwater, it bent, but never broke. Yet the shadow of Assyria lingered. Every new Babylonian ruler had to calculate how far he could push before northern armies returned. By the 9th century BCE, Assyria had reemerged from its own period of instability stronger than ever. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III expanded westward into the Levant, transforming the empire into a military-industrial machine. Babylon, by comparison, looked provincial rich in heritage, but poor in steel. And yet the Assyrians could not simply destroy it. They needed its legitimacy. The rituals of kingship, the blessings of Marduk, the scribal expertise, all were tools of rule that Assyria lacked. So began the uneasy pattern that would define the next 300 years. Assyria conquers. Babylon resists. Assyria restores. Babylon revolts. Each time both sides claimed divine justification. Each time the gods remained frustratingly silent. Babylon's kings were not without resourcefulness. Some courted Assyria with gifts and oaths, hoping to preserve autonomy through diplomacy. Others played the long game, offering tribute when necessary, rebellion when opportunity arose. The city's priesthood became a political force in its own right, alternately cooperating with and undermining whatever ruler held the palace. They alone controlled the ceremonies that confirmed kingship. Without them, no monarch, Assyrian or Babylonian, could claim the favor of Marduk. This delicate balance, this chess match of faith and politics, would endure for generations. But by the 8th century BCE, Assyria's patience was wearing thin. Its kings no longer saw Babylon as a partner in civilization, but as a chronic problem to be solved once and for all. Soon, a new breed of rulers, ruthless, ambitious, and utterly unromantic, would rise in the north. They would stop pretending to be Babylon's brothers and start acting as its masters. And Babylon, proud as ever, would meet them with rebellion after rebellion, even when the cost was ruin. The long shadow of Assyria had fallen across the land, but in that shadow, Babylon's stubborn light still flickered, an ember that refused to go out. By the middle of the 8th century BCE, the shadow that had long stretched from Assyria over Babylon thickened into storm clouds. The polite fictions of shared kingship and brotherly diplomacy were finished. Assyria was done pretending. The kings who now ruled from Nineveh and Kalhu were not diplomats or caretakers. They were engineers of empire, and their vision left little room for sentiment. At their head was Tiglath-Pileser III, a man whose name alone made scribes in Babylon tighten their styluses. When he seized the Assyrian throne in 745 BCE, likely through a coup, he inherited an army but built a machine. He reorganized the empire into provinces ruled by governors, loyal only to him, introduced a system of mass deportations to break resistance, and transformed conquest from spectacle into administration. Assyria would no longer collect tribute. It would own its territories. Babylon, ancient and dignified, was next. At that moment, the city was under a native ruler, Nabu-Nasir, a pious and competent king who still kept the rituals of Marduk and perhaps naively believed that careful diplomacy could keep Assyria at bay. He sent gifts north, hosted embassies, and tried to preserve the illusion of sovereignty. For a time, it worked. Babylon enjoyed a modest revival. Trade returned, the scribes compiled astronomical records so accurate that later Greek scholars would still use them for reference. The old city was breathing again, but Tiglath-Pileser did not believe in breathing room. His empire was designed to absorb, not coexist. When civil wars and rebellions erupted in Babylonia's borderlands, Assyria intervened to restore order, the ancient euphemism for invasion. By 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser marched south, occupied Babylon, and performed the ultimate political magic trick. He crowned himself king of Babylon. For the first time in recorded history, the same man wore both the Assyrian and Babylonian crowns. In theory, this was a masterstroke. In practice, it was heresy wrapped in paperwork. The priests of Marduk were polite, but their smiles were carved from granite. To them, the Assyrian king was an outsider who dared to rule without divine invitation. Still, Tiglath-Pileser played the part well. He financed temple restorations, sponsored the New Year festival, and spoke reverently of Marduk in his inscriptions. He even paraded through Babylon's streets during the Akkadu festival as the god's chosen protector. It was brilliant propaganda, an attempt to fuse two civilizations into one imperial ideology. But beneath the choreography, resentment brewed. Every act of reverence came from a conqueror's hand, and every tax collector who wore the Assyrian seal reminded Babylonians that the illusion of equality was dead. After Tiglath-Pileser's death, Assyria's grip only tightened. His successors, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, treated Babylon as both asset and liability, alternately patronizing and punishing it. The Chaldean tribes of the south, proud and restless, saw opportunity in every transition of power. They had been part of Babylonia for generations, farmers, raiders, traders, but now they began to dream of kingship. One of them would soon make that dream real. When Sargon II took the Assyrian throne in 722 BCE, the southern marshes erupted in rebellion under a Chaldean chief named Marduk Apla-iddina, known to later ages as Merodach-Baladan. With the support of Elam to the east, he swept into Babylon, seized the crown, and proclaimed himself king. It was a stunning reversal, a tribal leader ruling the greatest city on earth. His message was simple: Babylon would be ruled by Babylonians again. For 12 bright, defiant years, Merodach-Baladan held the throne. He restored the temple of Marduk, reopened festivals, and rebuilt city walls. To the people, he was a folk hero. To Assyria, a mosquito with delusions of grandeur. Sargon tolerated him. At first he had bigger problems in the west, but when his empire was secure, he turned south. In 710 BCE, the Assyrian armies descended. Merodach-Baladan fled to the swamps his allies scattered, and Sargon entered Babylon in triumph. But unlike his more brutal predecessors, he chose a softer touch. He presented himself not as conqueror, but as restorer, the chosen of Marduk. He rebuilt what war had broken, reappointed local officials, and personally took part in sacred ceremonies. For a brief moment, Babylon seemed at peace again, an imperial jewel polished to shine under new management. Yet peace in Assyro-Babylonian relations was always an illusion drawn in sand. When Sargon was killed in battle 5 years later, Merodach-Baladan resurfaced from exile like a ghost that refused to die. He reclaimed the throne for a second time, only to be crushed again by Sargon's successor, the infamous Sennacherib. The tug-of-war between northern power and southern pride had become a cycle. Every time Assyria extended a hand in friendship, Babylon bit it. Every time Assyria raised its sword, the city endured and waited for another chance. The struggle was no longer merely political. It had become existential. For Assyria, Babylon was an unruly province. For Babylonians, Assyria was an empire without a soul. And soon, the storm that had been building for decades would break completely. The next Assyrian king would decide that reconciliation was a fool's dream, and that the only way to end Babylon's defiance was to erase it from the map. The gods of the south were about to meet the fury of the north. By the late 8th century BCE, Babylon's rebellions had become a seasonal rhythm, like the flooding of the Euphrates expected and impossible to prevent. Each Assyrian king, no matter how powerful, eventually found himself dragged into the swampy southern lands, fighting not professional armies, but stubborn clans who melted into the reeds and struck back at night. Those clans were the Chaldeans, and they were rewriting the script of Babylonian history. The Chaldeans had always been there in some form, living in the marshlands near the Persian Gulf, where water and land blurred into a shifting maze of channels and islands. They were Semitic-speaking, like their Babylonian neighbors, but their roots were tribal, not urban. They moved with the currents, traded fish and reeds, built boats that slid like ghosts through the canals. To city dwellers, they were barbarians. To themselves, they were free men in a world of kings and scribes. By the 8th century, their freedom had turned into ambition. Babylon's constant weakness under Assyrian domination gave them an opening. The old Babylonian nobility was divided. The priesthood, wary, the population, weary of foreign rulers who called themselves kings but worshipped strange gods. The Chaldeans, rough and charismatic, offered something new. Local leadership, drawn not from bureaucrats or temples, but from warriors who knew the land better than anyone. The most famous of these was Marduk-apla-iddina II, the man history remembers as Merodach-Baladan. He rose from the marshes like a storm from nowhere, leading a coalition of southern tribes and old Babylonian loyalists. The priests of Marduk saw in him a chance to reclaim dignity. The people saw in him the embodiment of resistance. In 722 BCE, as Assyria reeled from civil unrest following the death of Shalmaneser V, Marduk-apla-iddina seized his moment. He entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The crowds cheered. The temple bells rang for the first time in years. Marduk's statue was carried in solemn procession through the streets. The priests declared that the god himself had chosen this Chaldean as king. It was a masterstroke of symbolism, the return of Babylonian independence wrapped in divine approval. For the next 12 years, Merodach-Baladan ruled with surprising competence. He fortified canals, reopened trade with Elam to the east, and re-established Babylon's festivals and archives. His letters to foreign rulers show a man fluent in diplomacy, fully aware that legitimacy was as important as victory. He corresponded with Judah and Tyre, and may even have sent envoys as far as Egypt. For a brief moment, Babylon stood again as a sovereign power, the last flicker of Mesopotamian independence before the age of empire swallowed it whole. But Assyria does not forgive. When Sargon II consolidated his rule in the north, he turned his gaze southward. He could not allow a rebel, however charismatic, to sit on Babylon's throne and call himself king. In 710 BCE, the Assyrian armies came disciplined and inexorable. The campaign was brutal. Marduk-apla-iddina's allies deserted him. Elam's promises proved hollow, and Babylon's walls could not withstand siege. The Chaldean king fled to the marshes, his ancestral refuge, while Sargon entered the city in triumph. Yet Sargon understood something his predecessors had not. Babylon could not be ruled by fear alone. He presented himself as a restorer, not a destroyer. He rebuilt temples, paid for sacrifices to Marduk, and even took part in the New Year festival. His inscriptions read like poetry of reconciliation. I returned the hearts of the gods to their dwelling. It was imperial genius occupation, disguised as piety. For a time, peace returned. Babylon functioned as part of the Assyrian Empire, a prized province, whose scribes and astronomers filled Assyrian libraries with knowledge. But beneath the calm resentment fermented like wine left too long in the heat. The Chaldeans scattered, but undefeated, waited in the southern swamps, their loyalty not to Sargon or any empire, but to the idea of Babylonian freedom. When Sargon fell in battle in 705 BCE, the Assyrian Empire trembled, and the marshes stirred again. Marduk-apla-iddina, old but unbroken, returned from exile and reclaimed the Babylonian throne. For 9 months he ruled a ghost of rebellion reborn, until the new Assyrian king Sennacherib came with vengeance. The Chaldean king fled once more into the marshes, vanishing from history, but not from memory. To the Babylonians, he was the last true king before the darkness, a symbol of pride against tyranny. To Assyria, he was a persistent infection proof that Babylon's heart could never be subdued. The Assyrians now faced a terrible choice: to keep playing this endless game of conquest and restoration, or to end it once and for all. The next king, Sennacherib, chose the latter. He would not reason with Babylon, nor flatter its gods. He would drown it. The river that had given Babylon life would soon be turned against it. By the final decade of the 8th century BCE, Babylon had defied Assyria for generations, and the patience of its northern overlords had finally run dry. The new Assyrian king, Sennacherib, son of Sargon II, inherited not just an empire, but a grudge. To him, Babylon was less a city than a chronic wound, rebellious, sanctimonious, forever invoking divine privilege to justify insurrection. And Sennacherib was not a man who believed in divine privilege unless it wore his crown. At first, he tried restraint. Upon ascending the throne in 705 BCE, he allowed Babylon its own ruler, his own son, Ashur-nadin-shumi, hoping blood ties might bind the city's loyalty. The experiment lasted barely a decade. The Chaldean clans, those perpetual marsh-born insurgents, rose again. The old spirit of Marduk-apla-iddina still lingered in their songs, and with the help of Elam, the eastern highland kingdom that had plagued Mesopotamia for centuries, Babylon once more slipped from Assyrian hands. Then came the breaking point. In 694 BCE, Elamite forces swept in from the east, captured Ashur-nadin-shumi, and carried him off into exile, where he disappeared from all records. To Sennacherib, it was not merely rebellion, it was sacrilege. Babylon had stolen his son, humiliated his dynasty, and mocked the will of the gods. The punishment would be biblical in scale, and ironically would become the Bible's own symbol of divine wrath. Sennacherib gathered his armies and marched south in what can only be described as fury given form. The campaign lasted years, grinding through the plains, the canals, the marshes. Babylon was besieged, its allies crushed one by one. The Elamites were defeated, their forces scattered back into the mountains. And then in 689 BCE, the king gave an order that would echo for millennia: Babylon was to be destroyed, not subdued, not occupied, erased. The Assyrian chronicles record the act with chilling precision. The waters of the Euphrates were diverted through the city, flooding its streets and temples. When the torrent receded, Sennacherib's engineers tore down what the flood had spared. Walls were dismantled, bricks carried away for reuse in Assyrian cities, temples burned to ash. The statue of Marduk, long the heart of Babylonian religion, was taken once again, not in reverence, but as plunder. Sennacherib's own inscriptions boast of the devastation. With icy pride, I made its destruction more complete than that by a flood. I tore down its walls, temples, and towers. I swept away the ruins with water. I made it like a meadow. He claimed the gods themselves had commanded him that Marduk's people had become corrupt and that their punishment was righteous. But even among his own scribes, the act seemed to cross an invisible line. Babylon was not just another city. It was sacred ground, the axis of Mesopotamian civilization. To destroy it was to tamper with the cosmic balance. In the theology of the time, such hubris demanded eventual retribution. Indeed, Sennacherib's empire began to change after that. The wealth of Babylon flowed north to his capital of Nineveh, where he built vast palaces and gardens, perhaps as a kind of overcompensation for the city he had drowned. Yet among his subjects, even among Assyrians, whispers spread that the gods were displeased. Sennacherib's violent death years later, at the hands of his own sons, would be remembered as divine vengeance for Babylon's destruction. But before that reckoning, there was silence, a long, terrible silence where a city had once been. The floodwaters receded. The ruins dried in the sun. For a generation, the site of Babylon lay empty. Pilgrims came and wept at the desolation. The air that had once been thick with the smoke of temple incense now smelled only of dust and clay. And yet Babylon's story was never one of endings. Even in ruin, it was impossible to forget. The Assyrians themselves could not ignore it for long. The vacuum it left, political, spiritual, symbolic, was too powerful. The gods demanded balance, and even conquerors felt compelled to restore what they had destroyed. That task would fall to Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, who inherited both an empire and a curse. He would spend his reign trying to undo the sins of his father, to rebuild Babylon, brick by brick, and to make peace with the gods his dynasty had offended. The empire of Assyria would learn too late what every conqueror learns about Babylon. You can flood its streets and scatter its people, but you can never truly bury its name. The ruins of Babylon steamed under the Mesopotamian sun. For years, the smell of scorched brick and silted river water, still lingering long after Sennacherib's fury, had faded into dust. The canals had become stagnant pools, the ziggurats skeletal mounds. To travelers, it must have seemed that the gods had finally abandoned the cradle of civilization. Yet the ancient world was never comfortable with silence. The destruction of Babylon was a crime against the divine order, and even the empire that had caused it could feel the imbalance. When Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, came to power in 681 BCE, he inherited not only the Assyrian throne, but also the guilt of his father's sacrilege. The story of Esarhaddon's reign begins with blood. Sennacherib was murdered by two of his own sons, perhaps as the chroniclers liked to believe at Marduk's command. The gods, they whispered, had avenged Babylon. Esarhaddon, a younger son who had narrowly escaped the purge, returned from exile to claim the throne. His first acts as king were not of conquest, but of atonement. He rebuilt temples across Assyria, performed lavish sacrifices, and commissioned oracles to determine what could placate the heavens. The message was always the same. Until Babylon was restored, Assyria itself would remain cursed. So Esarhaddon did the unthinkable. The empire that had raised Babylon would now rebuild it. The king announced his intentions in solemn proclamations. I will return the god Marduk to his home. I will restore Babylon and make it shine again like the sun. This was more than policy, it was cosmic diplomacy. In the theology of Mesopotamia, each city was a reflection of a divine realm. To rebuild Babylon was to repair the fabric of creation. To ignore it was to live under divine disfavor. The project began around 678 BCE. Thousands of laborers, artisans, and priests descended upon the ruins. They drained the marshes, cleared the debris left by Sennacherib's floods, and began to raise the foundations anew. Esarhaddon personally oversaw the effort, traveling to the site and recording the progress on stone cylinders buried in the rebuilt walls. The gods looked with joy upon my deeds, he wrote. I restored the city to its ancient plan. I rebuilt the temples of the great gods and returned their sanctuaries to splendor. It was a restoration both spiritual and political. Esarhaddon understood that ruling Babylon required more than military power. It required legitimacy, and legitimacy flowed from the priesthood of Marduk. He courted them carefully, granting autonomy to temple estates and showering them with endowments. The priests, pragmatic as ever, accepted his gestures. They knew a penitent king was better than a vengeful one. In 669 BCE, Esarhaddon's reconstruction was nearly complete. The city walls rose again. The Esagila temple gleamed under new glazed bricks, and the ziggurat at Emenanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, was restored. The statue of Marduk, which had been kept in Nineveh since Sennacherib's sack, was ceremonially returned to its shrine. Priests washed it in sacred water, reclothed it in gold, and proclaimed that the god had forgiven Babylon. The moment was heavy with symbolism. The king who had rebuilt Babylon was the son of the man who destroyed it. Esarhaddon portrayed himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of divine harmony. His inscriptions no longer boasted of massacres or floods. Instead, they spoke of compassion, justice, and the healing of nations. It was a rare note of humility in a world usually carved in arrogance. This new approach extended beyond Babylon. Esarhaddon sought to maintain peace through reconstruction, not annihilation. He rebuilt cities in Syria, restored temples in Egypt, and reorganized the empire's administration to avoid the brutality that had defined his father's rule. Yet even this enlightened policy was laced with politics. By rebuilding Babylon, he bound its priesthood to Assyria's fate. The city would rise again, but as part of the imperial system, not as its rival. Still, Babylon's spirit was not so easily tamed. The city accepted Esarhaddon's gifts, but beneath the ceremonies of reconciliation, it remained. Babylon, proud, self-conscious, convinced of its cosmic importance. The priests smiled during festivals, but they also preserved texts that cursed Assyria's arrogance and prophesied Babylon's eventual triumph. Forgiveness in Mesopotamia was always conditional. When Esarhaddon died in 669 BCE, his plan for stability was handed to his sons, Ashurbanipal, who would rule Assyria, and Shamash-Shum-Ukin, whom he appointed as king of Babylon. It was a bold experiment, a dual monarchy meant to maintain harmony between north and south, between the sword and the pen. For a time it even worked. Babylon was rebuilt, its gods restored, its festivals revived. The city glowed once more on the plain. But balance is fragile, and brotherhood is rarely simple. In giving Babylon to one son, and Assyria to another, Esarhaddon hoped to unite the two halves of his empire. What he created instead was a slow fuse that would ignite the next great tragedy of Mesopotamian history. When Esarhaddon divided his empire between his sons, he imagined peace, a balance between sword and scripture, between northern power and southern pride. But few kings have ever handed their children a double crown and expected them not to fight over it. The plan was elegant in theory and tragic in execution. The elder son, Ashurbanipal, would rule mighty Assyria from Nineveh. The younger Shamash-Shum-Ukin would govern Babylon under his brother's benevolent supervision. It was like asking a lion and a priest to share a throne. At first, the arrangement worked. The new king of Babylon began his reign in 668 BCE with the usual pomp processions offerings to Marduk, the recitation of hymns declaring divine favor. Assyrian envoys stood politely beside Babylonian priests as the city celebrated its restoration. Ashurbanipal, though ruling from afar, confirmed his brother's status and sent regular shipments of gold and building materials. For a time, the brothers exchanged warm letters dripping with ceremonial affection. But beneath the surface, the partnership was uneasy. Ashurbanipal was every inch an Assyrian emperor, confident, scholarly, and ruthless. He ruled with an intelligence sharpened by paranoia, commanding armies that could level cities, and a bureaucracy that recorded every sigh of obedience. His libraries overflowed with tablets, his spies with secrets. Babylon's king, in contrast, governed a city that had always preferred charm to chains. Shamash-shum-ukin wanted dignity. His brother offered oversight. Assyria's supervision was suffocating. Babylonian officials were answerable to Assyrian governors. Taxes were collected in the name of Nineveh. Even temple affairs were quietly monitored by northern scribes. To the priests of Marduk, it felt less like a partnership and more like a leash. Babylon had been rebuilt in stone, but spiritually it remained captive. At first, Shamash-shum-ukin swallowed his pride. He performed his brother's rituals of loyalty, sent tributes, and waited for a sign that trust might grow. But the Assyrian court never stopped reminding him of his place. Envoys from Nineveh began to bypass him, entirely dealing directly with local officials. Soldiers stationed in Babylon reported not to their king, but to his brother. In clay correspondence preserved by Ashurbanipal's archivists, the tone shifts from courteous to cold. The king of Assyria commands his servant, the king of Babylon. By the early 650s BCE, the insult had become unbearable. Shamash-shum-ukin began to prepare in secret, quietly forging alliances with Elam, the Aramean tribes, and the Chaldean clans of the south. He sent envoys across the desert to western princes and even to Arabia, promising freedom from Assyrian tribute. Babylon's priests, masters of timing and subtlety, whispered prophecies that Marduk's favor had returned to the true son of Esarhaddon. The city stirred with ancient pride. Then in 652 BCE, the long peace cracked. Shamash-shum-ukin declared open rebellion. The temples rang with hymns of defiance. The Chaldeans and Elamites poured north in support. The king of Babylon proclaimed that he was liberating his city from tyranny, restoring the balance his father had intended. The Assyrian response was swift, organized, and merciless. Ashurbanipal unleashed his armies with a cold precision that made earlier campaigns look like rehearsal. Columns of troops advanced down the Euphrates and Tigris, crushing the rebel cities one by one. The Assyrian chronicles described the war as a cleansing storm, a purification of the land. The reality was famine, siege, and fire. Elam's help faltered. Its armies were beaten back across the mountains. The desert allies melted away. Babylon was left to face the empire alone. The siege of Babylon lasted nearly 2 years. The Assyrians surrounded the city, cutting its canals, blocking food and trade. Inside, hunger became horror. Contemporary tablets speak of disease, of people boiling leather to eat of temples stripped bare for rations. The priests prayed to Marduk, but even the god's statue remained silent. Babylon, once the symbol of endurance, was dying behind its walls. In 648 BCE, the end came. Fires raged through the streets as Assyrian troops forced their way inside. Shamash-shum-ukin, cornered in his palace, refused capture. The chronicles say he entered his house and set it aflame, perishing in the inferno, rather than endure his brother's triumph. Others whispered he was consumed by the fire as punishment from the gods. To Ashurbanipal, it made little difference Babylon had fallen. Yet once again, the conqueror hesitated at the brink of total ruin. He had seen what happened to his grandfather, Sennacherib, cursed for flooding the city. So Ashurbanipal chose a different ending. He did not destroy Babylon utterly. He restored it. Temples were rebuilt, the statue of Marduk reconsecrated, and order reimposed under Assyrian watch, of course. The empire wanted not ashes, but obedience. Ashurbanipal styled himself king of the 4 quarters of the world, ruler of both Assyria and Babylon. His libraries swelled with Babylonian wisdom. His scribes copied its tablets by the thousands. Ironically, it was through his obsessive preservation that much of Babylon's literature, its epics, omens, and star charts survived into later ages. Even in defeat, Babylon educated its conqueror. But the moral of the brothers' war was clear. The union of North and South was an illusion. Assyria could build over Babylon, but never with it. Every attempt at reconciliation only deepened the fracture. The Assyrians learned to fear their prize. The Babylonians learned that waiting was their greatest weapon. And soon, that patience would pay off. For in the generation after Ashurbanipal's death, Assyria's iron empire began to rust from within, and from those same southern marshes that had birthed rebellion after rebellion, a new power was rising. One last time, Babylon would rise from the dust, not as subject, but as master. When the fires of the brothers' war finally burned out, Assyria stood triumphant but hollow. The great king, Ashurbanipal, ruled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to Egypt, yet its strength was already brittle, a veneer of glory over exhaustion. The old order was crumbling beneath the weight of its own victories, and in the ruins of the south, the ancient city of Babylon was quietly taking note. For decades, Babylon had played the part of the obedient province, performing the rituals, sending tribute, reciting the oaths. But the people remembered. They remembered Sennacherib's flood and Ashurbanipal's siege. They remembered the starving streets and the burning palace of Shamash-Shumukin. They remembered what it felt like to bow, and they hated it. After Ashurbanipal's death, around 631 BCE, Assyria began to fracture. Civil wars broke out between his heirs. Governors rebelled. Generals carved up provinces like scavengers dividing a carcass. The once unstoppable Assyrian army turned on itself. It was the perfect moment for Babylon to breathe and to sharpen its knives. Out of this chaos emerged a man whose name the Assyrians would learn to fear, Nabopolassar, a Chaldean general of shrewd patience and quiet fire. He was not born into royal blood. Few of Babylon's liberators ever were. But he possessed the one quality that had eluded Babylon's kings for centuries timing. In 626 BCE, Nabopolassar was appointed governor of the southern lands under nominal Assyrian authority. Within months, he revolted. His troops seized Babylon itself, expelled the Assyrian garrison, and proclaimed him king. For the first time in almost 100 years, the city of Marduk was free. The rebellion spread like flame through dry reeds. The southern cities, Uruk-Nippur, all declared for Nabopolassar. To the north, the Assyrian generals tried to regroup, but their supply lines were stretched thin, their morale cracked. Babylon, reborn under Chaldean leadership, had found its moment. At first, the struggle was desperate. The Assyrians struck back repeatedly, retaking Babylon in 623 BCE and forcing Nabopolassar to retreat. But like his predecessors in the marshes, he knew when to vanish. His forces melted into the countryside, harassing supply lines, ambushing convoys, striking and disappearing into the reeds. Each year, Assyria regained less ground. Each year, Nabopolassar returned stronger. The turning point came with an alliance that changed the fate of empires. To the northeast, another power had risen, the Medes, fierce highland warriors under Cyaxares, who had also suffered under Assyrian dominance. Nabopolassar saw in them what no Babylonian had seen before: partners, not rivals. Around 616 BCE, Babylon and Media sealed a pact, an unprecedented union of mountain and plain spear and tablet. Together, they would tear down Nineveh brick by brick. For 3 years, the allied armies closed in on the Assyrian heartland. Cities fell in rapid succession: Ashur-Kal-Hu, and finally Nineveh itself, the proud capital of Assyria, the city of endless palaces and libraries. In 612 BCE, after a long siege, its walls crumbled. The Medes stormed in from the north, the Babylonians from the south. Fire consumed what had once been the Empire of Iron. Ashurbanipal's empire, which had seemed eternal, vanished in smoke. Ancient chroniclers describe it with awe and finality. Great Nineveh was made a ruin heap, one tablet reads. Its people fled into the rivers, its gods were taken, and its kings perished. The conquerors divided the spoils. The Medes took the mountains. Babylon claimed the plains. Nabopolassar returned home not as a rebel, but as the founder of a new dynasty, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He was careful not to repeat the arrogance of Assyria. His rule was pragmatic, cautious, and devout. He restored the temples of Marduk and Ishtar, repaired canals, and reopened trade routes that war had severed. Babylon's economy revived, its festivals returned, and its scholars resumed the sacred observation of the stars. For the first time in centuries, the city was not under occupation, nor recovering from one. It was the center of power, the axis of the world once more. In the ruins of Nineveh, the ghosts of old Assyrian kings might have watched in disbelief as Babylon's banners rose over the land they once ruled. The empire that had been crushed, flooded, burned, and rebuilt now ruled its former conquerors' lands. It was as though Marduk himself had waited patiently through centuries of humiliation to restore his city's throne. But Nabopolassar was no myth maker. He was old, pragmatic, and wary of hubris. He spent his later years securing borders and grooming his heir, a son whose ambitions far exceeded his father's restraint. That son would lead Babylon into its golden age, transforming it from a restored city into the greatest metropolis the ancient world had ever seen. His name was Nebuchadnezzar II, and he would build an empire of blue-glazed walls, hanging gardens, and biblical legend. The torch of Babylon had passed from rebellion to resurrection, from vengeance to vision. When Nabopolassar died in 605 BCE, Babylon wept, but not in despair. The city had seen too many deaths, too many ruins. This time, it mourned a king whose passing marked triumph, not tragedy. His son, Nebuchadnezzar II, inherited not a broken realm, but a rising one, a rare inheritance in Mesopotamian history. For the first time in 1,000 years, Babylon was not merely surviving. It was poised to dominate the world. Nebuchadnezzar was the kind of ruler Babylon had waited centuries for: intelligent, ambitious, ruthless, when necessary, and above all, visionary. He had learned from both Babylon's suffering and Assyria's arrogance. Where the Assyrians ruled through terror, he would rule through spectacle by building a city so magnificent that conquest would seem unnecessary. But first, there was war to finish. His father's last campaigns had left the Assyrian remnants clinging to life in the north, propped up by Egypt, the only great power still capable of challenging Babylon. In 605 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar led his armies westward, meeting the Egyptians at Carchemish on the banks of the Euphrates. The battle was decisive and brutal. Babylon's chariots thundered across the plains. Egypt's army broke and fled. The victory was total. Within a year, Babylonian banners flew over Syria, Phoenicia, and much of Palestine. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Traders from Tyre brought cedar and purple dye caravans from Arabia, carried frankincense and gold, and envoys from far kingdoms came to pay homage. Babylon's influence once again reached horizons it had not seen since Hammurabi's age. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was no mere conqueror. He was a builder, an architect king, with the soul of an engineer and the ego of a god. His ambition was not just to rule Babylon, but to reinvent it. He poured the wealth of conquest into the capital. The city's walls were rebuilt and expanded until they stretched for miles, so massive that later Greek historians would claim they were wide enough for chariots to race side by side along the ramparts. The processional street, paved in limestone and adorned with reliefs of lions and dragons, led directly to the jewel of his creation, the Ishtar Gate. The gate was a masterpiece of glazed brickwork, its surface shimmering in blues and golds that caught the Mesopotamian sun like water. Rows of mythic beasts, aurochs lions, and serpent dragons marched in eternal parade along its surface. Through that gate, every year, the statue of Marduk was carried during the Akitu festival, symbolizing the renewal of the cosmos and the king's divine favor. To walk through that gate was to feel the weight of civilization itself. Behind the walls, Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into a maze of palaces, temples, and gardens. Canals were dredged and lined with stone. Aqueducts carried water into the heart of the city. Bridges spanned the Euphrates, linking its twin halves. It was not only a capital, it was a statement that human hands guided by divine will could remake the earth. And then there was the Hanging Gardens, the legend that would outlive him. Ancient writers described terraces of green rising above the city, watered by ingenious pumps, lush with palm cypress and fruit trees that defied the desert heat. Whether they were real or an ancient dream of paradise, they embodied Babylon's spirit, human mastery over chaos, beauty, suspended between heaven and earth. But Nebuchadnezzar's ambitions were not limited to architecture. He was also the consummate imperial administrator. He strengthened the army, standardized weights and measures, and expanded Babylon's bureaucracy. Trade flourished. Art and astronomy advanced. The city's scribes compiled massive astronomical diaries recording eclipses, planetary motions, and omens with scientific precision. Under Nebuchadnezzar, the stars themselves seemed to orbit Babylon. Yet beneath this splendor ran darker currents. The same drive that built Babylon's towers also drove Nebuchadnezzar's conquests. When the kingdom of Judah rebelled against him, he responded with brutal efficiency. In 597 BCE, Jerusalem fell. Its king was taken captive. When the city rebelled again, a decade later, Nebuchadnezzar returned with fire. The Temple of Solomon was destroyed, and thousands were exiled to Babylon, the beginning of the Babylonian captivity that would shape Jewish history and theology for centuries. Ironically, these exiles would later immortalize Babylon's name in their scriptures, not as a city of learning and law, but as a symbol of arrogance, sin, and divine punishment. To them, Babylon was not the mother of civilization, but the tower that reached too high. Yet within the city's walls, those same exiles learned its language, studied its astronomy, and absorbed its myths. Proof that even as Babylon conquered nations, it also absorbed them in return. For 43 years, Nebuchadnezzar ruled a realm that seemed invincible. Under his reign, the canals ran clear, the temples glittered, and the empire's coffers overflowed. His inscriptions speak less of blood and conquest than of architecture and devotion. I built for Marduk, Lord of the Gods, a house of wonder for eternity. When he died around 562 BCE, the city he left behind was the crown of the ancient world, a labyrinth of blue walls, golden shrines, and terraces of green. Foreign visitors marveled that such a place could exist. Even centuries later, Alexander the Great would choose to die there, as if history itself demanded he pay homage to its ghost. But empires built on genius are fragile things. After Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon's throne would wobble under weaker kings' intrigue and the slow return of complacency. The city that had outlasted 1,000 years of enemies was about to meet one it could not outlast, an empire of disciplined roads and inevitability. To the east, a new power was rising under the banners of Cyrus of Persia, a conqueror who would take Babylon not with floods or fire, but with patience and policy. By the height of Nebuchadnezzar II's reign, Babylon was not just a city, it was the world. To step through its gates was to enter a universe built from brick and belief, a metropolis where the divine and the mundane met in every marketplace, where the geometry of the streets mirrored the cosmos itself. Foreigners who came to trade or pay tribute often said they had never seen anything so vast, so ordered, so alive. Within the walls, life pulsed like the rhythm of the Euphrates. The city's population may have reached 200,000, a miracle of urban density for its time. Merchants, soldiers, scribes, priests, craftsmen, and slaves all moved through the same narrow streets, separated by status, but united by proximity. Babylon was a mosaic of tongues, Akkadian and Aramaic in the markets, Hebrew in the exile quarters, Persian traders already whispering at the docks, Egyptian and Phoenician sailors calling from the harbors along the canals. The city was divided by the river, bridged by stone and by culture. On one bank stood the great palaces and administrative quarters, the beating, bureaucratic heart of empire. On the other, the sprawling temple complex of Esagila, crowned by Etemenanke, the great ziggurat that towered into the desert sky. Its name meant house of the foundation of heaven and earth, and it dominated every horizon, a staircase between mankind and the gods. At dawn, priests ascended its terraces to perform rituals that kept the cosmos in balance, offerings of bread oil, and incense whispered prayers timed with the first light of the sun. Babylon's religion was less about conversion than choreography. Every movement, every chant was part of an ancient pattern that sustained creation itself. To skip a sacrifice was to risk cosmic disorder, a terrifying thought in a city that had once been drowned by its own river. Below the temples, the city buzzed with practical devotion. The gods were everywhere, engraved on doorways, carved into seals invoked in contracts. Every trade had its patron deity Ea for the craftsmen, Nabu for the scribes, Ishtar for the lovers and warriors who sought both favor and forgiveness. Even the taverns carried small clay figures of protective spirits, half reminder and half insurance policy. Commerce was the bloodstream of Babylon. Along the canal markets, spices from Arabia mingled with cedar from Lebanon, tin from the highlands, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Grain barges from the southern plains crowded the wharves, their hulls heavy with barley bound for royal granaries. The economy was run not by coins, but by contracts, tablets, impressed with cuneiform signs, sealed in clay envelopes, stored in vast temple archives that served as both banks and courthouses. A merchant might leave his silver with the temple of Marduk, and months later retrieve it with interest, an early echo of modern finance, born from piety and pragmatism. The scribes who managed this paperwork were the quiet rulers of the city. Trained from childhood, they learned not only to write, but to interpret omens, calculate taxes, and record celestial movements. Their offices smelled of clay and rushes, their fingers stained from styluses and sealing wax. Through them flowed the invisible arteries of the empire law, trade, and prophecy, and above them all loomed the palace. Nebuchadnezzar's royal compound was not merely a home, but a statement walls of glazed tile reliefs of lions and bulls, and endless inscriptions praising Marduk and the king's devotion. Courtiers in linen robes moved between colonnades. Envoys waited nervously in outer chambers. Scribes scurried with tablets bearing decrees sealed with the royal stamp. The king himself was rarely seen, but his presence was felt everywhere in the taxes that funded the walls, the soldiers who patrolled the gates, and the festivals that celebrated his role as Marduk's chosen steward. The Akatu, the New Year festival, was the greatest of these. Each spring, when the floods receded and the fields began to green, the statue of Marduk was carried in grand procession from his temple through the city to the Akatu house beyond the walls. The king walked humbly before it, stripped of his regalia, slapped by the high priest to symbolize his submission to the god. If tears came to his eyes, as they were meant to, the omen was good. The king's sincerity would guarantee the fertility of the land. For 10 days, Babylon became a theater of renewal. Music, feasting, sacrifices, and recitations of the Enuma Elish, the great creation epic that told how Marduk had slain the dragon of chaos and founded the ordered world. It was theology performed as civic pride. Yet for all its grandeur, Babylon was still a living city, loud, imperfect, and deeply human. Children played in alleys under the shade of mud brick houses. Lovers carved their initials into the glaze of blue walls. Scholars argued over omens in the taverns, and prisoners prayed to the same gods as their captors. The river brought both wealth and danger each flood season, reminding the citizens that even the city of the gods owed its life to mud and current. To outsiders, Babylon seemed eternal. Travelers from distant lands rode in awe of its scale and beauty, of the hanging gardens that seemed to float above the skyline of the night skies, alive with constellations charted by its astronomers. They called it the Gate of the Gods, the link between heaven and earth. But those within its walls, the priests and merchants and generals who had studied history too closely, knew better. No city lasts forever, not even one built by divine favor. Empires rise on order and fall to entropy, and somewhere in the east, faint. But growing came whispers of another king, another empire, another inevitable dawn. Babylon's walls gleamed beneath the stars, its canals shimmered with moonlight, and its temples thrummed with hymns, but the world beyond them was changing. By the time the 6th century BCE reached its twilight, Babylon stood at the height of splendor and on the edge of decline, though few inside its blue walls could feel it. The city glittered, as it always had. Its priests chanted, its markets overflowed, and its astronomers recorded the heavens. But empires do not die of sudden wounds. They die of momentum. The machine Nebuchadnezzar built was still running, but no one was truly steering it. After the great king's death, a short parade of weaker rulers took the throne. One was assassinated by his own nobles. Another lasted less than a year. And another was remembered mostly for mismanaging the temple estates. In this confusion rose Nabonidus, a man who would be Babylon's last independent king and one of its strangest. Nabonidus was not from the royal line. Some sources suggest he was of noble birth, others that he rose through the bureaucracy. What everyone agreed upon was that he was brilliant, eccentric, and profoundly devout, though not in the way his priests preferred. Where most Babylonian kings sought to please Marduk, the city's supreme deity, Nabonidus was obsessed with another god, Sin, the moon god of Haran. He claimed that Sin had chosen him, spoken to him, and guided his victories. In the cosmopolitan but hierarchical world of Babylonian religion, this was theological heresy. At first, the priests tolerated his eccentricities. But when Nabonidus began redirecting temple funds, elevating the cult of Sin above that of Marduk, and neglecting the sacred Akitu festival, tolerance turned to fury. To cancel that festival was not merely impolite, it was cosmic negligence, an offense that risked unbalancing heaven and earth. The king's refusal to participate was taken as proof that he had lost divine favor. Then, in one of the more puzzling acts in Babylonian history, Nabonidus left. He abandoned the capital and moved to Tama, a distant oasis city deep in Arabia. For 10 years, he ruled the empire from afar, conducting affairs by messenger while excavating ancient ruins and worshiping the moon. His son Belshazzar governed Babylon, in his absence competent enough to keep the city functioning, but not enough to calm its unrest. The empire's neighbors noticed the vacuum. To the east beyond the Zagros Mountains, a new force was rising, the Persians led by Cyrus the Great. Where Assyria had conquered through terror, Cyrus conquered through persuasion. He was as pragmatic as he was patient, promising liberation to the cities he absorbed and respect for their gods. To the peoples weary of empire, he was not a destroyer, but a restorer. As Nabonidus studied moonlight in Tema, Cyrus marched west, toppling the Median Empire and absorbing its lands. When he turned toward Mesopotamia, Babylon's defenses were formidable, but its unity was not. Many of its provinces, long neglected, saw Cyrus as a savior. Even within the priesthood, whispers spread that perhaps Marduk himself had chosen a new champion. In 539 BCE, Cyrus's army approached the city. Nabonidus returned from exile too late to rally true resistance. Babylon's walls were thick, its gates massive, its granaries full. A long siege could have held for years. But the Persians did not need years. Using the old canals of the Euphrates, they diverted the river's flow, lowering its level, enough for soldiers to march under the gates at night. The city awoke to find itself, conquered quietly, almost gently. There was no massacre, no flood, no destruction. The city that had been drowned by Sennacherib and burned by Ashurbanipal fell in silence. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. His proclamations, carved in cuneiform on the Cyrus cylinder, declared that Marduk himself had chosen him to restore peace and order. He returned the statues of local gods that Nabonidus had hoarded, allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands, and promised to respect Babylon's temples. For the first time in centuries, an invader understood Babylon's secret: to rule the city, you must first worship its god. To the Babylonians, the transition felt almost surreal. There was no sack, no rebellion. The city continued its daily rhythm. The markets opened, the temples sang, the scribes wrote. Only the language on the royal decrees changed. Empire had shifted hands like a ceremonial cup. Nabonidus was captured and exiled, his son Belshazzar likely killed. Cyrus was hailed as king of Babylon, king of the four quarters of the world. The priests resumed the Akkadu festival under his patronage. The bureaucrats kept their positions. The merchants resumed their trade. Civilization, ever pragmatic, carried on. But something essential had ended. The city that had once been the beating heart of Mesopotamia was now a province admired wealthy, but no longer free. The Persians would maintain Babylon's splendor, even use it as a royal residence, but it would never again rule the world. The dream of empire that had begun with Hammurabi, revived by the Kassites, avenged by Nabopolassar, and glorified by Nebuchadnezzar, was over. Yet Babylon itself endured, as it always did, by transforming defeat into myth. The Persians called it a jewel. The Greeks would call it a wonder, and the exiles who sang of it beside foreign rivers would call it Babel, the towered city that once reached for heaven and fell. Still within those fallen walls, life went on. Priests, chanting, children, playing by the canals, astronomers marking the paths of Venus across the night sky. Civilization had moved on, but Babylon remained the memory of what civilization meant. When the Persians took Babylon in 539 BCE, the story of the city should have ended there quietly, gracefully, like an old monarch retiring from the stage. But Babylon never truly dies. It lingers like incense in a temple long after the fire is out. Every civilization that followed would find itself haunted by her. Under Cyrus, the great Babylon did not burn or fade. It became a jewel in a new crown, the Persian Empire's richest province, the city of scholars and scribes, of temples, too ancient to destroy. Cyrus understood something his predecessors never had: to rule Babylon, you must respect her ghosts. He restored Marduk's temple, paid the priests, and performed the rituals of kingship as though he'd been born on the Euphrates. For a generation, Babylon seemed content. Its gods appeased its bureaucracy, intact, its wealth flowing. But even respect could not reverse time. The center of power had shifted east toward Persepolis and Susa. The great ceremonies still took place, but fewer pilgrims came. The temples still smoked with incense, but the hymns echoed in emptier halls. Babylon was no longer the world's heart. It was its memory. 2 centuries later, another conqueror marched through its gates, Alexander the Great. To him, Babylon was not a rival, but a dream. When he entered the city in 331 BCE, fresh from defeating the Persians at Gaugamela, he found streets still lined with ancient stones, canals glinting under moonlight, and ziggurats rising like mountains of history. He was awestruck. Unlike so many conquerors before him, Alexander did not wish to humble Babylon. He wanted to inherit it. He made it his capital. He ordered the rebuilding of the great Etemenanke ziggurat, which had crumbled under time and neglect. He walked in Nebuchadnezzar's gardens, consulted the priests of Marduk, and planned to make Babylon the administrative heart of his global empire. For a brief golden moment, the city's pulse quickened again. The old streets filled with Greek officers, Persian nobles, Babylonian merchants, all speaking in the polyglot hum of empire. And then, as if bound to its ancient curse, tragedy returned. In 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar and died at the height of his power at the center of the world. The irony was brutal. The world conqueror died in the city that had been conquering time itself. His death fractured his empire and ended Babylon's last true moment of glory. The centuries that followed were years of slow forgetting. The Seleucid kings founded new capitals closer to the Mediterranean. Parthians and later Romans let the city crumble. The canals clogged. The priests of Marduk grew old, their temples quiet, their gods outlasted by stone. By the time early travelers from Greece wandered through its ruins, Babylon was already legend. Yet its shadow persisted. The Bible turned Babylon into a symbol of arrogance and divine retribution, a city so proud it dared to reach heaven and was struck down. The Tower of Babel, born from the echo of the great ziggurat, became the story of humanity's ambition and its punishment. The Hebrew exiles who had wept by the rivers of Babylon transformed their pain into poetry, and that poetry became scripture. Babylon thus lived on, not as geography, but as metaphor. For later empires, Babylon became both warning and aspiration. The Romans admired its engineering. The Arabs studied its astronomy. The medieval world whispered of its gardens as one of the 7 wonders. Even as its bricks were quarried to build new towns, its name remained shorthand for greatness and decadence, wisdom and ruin. Babylon meant the city that has everything, and therefore, inevitably, everything to lose. Modern archaeologists who came to the site in the 19th century found not gold, but dust walls, eroded into mounds, inscriptions, broken canals, long dry. And yet, as they brushed away the sand, they uncovered humanity's first true archives tablets of law, prayer, mathematics, and myth. It was as if Babylon, even in ruin, had been waiting to speak again. Today, the name survives everywhere in scripture, in song, in metaphor. It has become a word larger than its ruins, a mirror for our own civilizations. Every time humanity builds a city that scrapes the clouds, or believes its empire, eternal Babylon, flickers in the background, a ghost reminding us how easily pride becomes archaeology. And yet there is tenderness in that ghost. Babylon was not merely hubris, it was hope made permanent, the belief that order and beauty could outlast chaos. Even its laws carved in basalt 4,000 years ago whisper the same stubborn optimism that the strong might not harm the weak, that justice can be written in stone. So the story ends as it began, between rivers, between faith and flood. The bricks have fallen, the temples are gone, but the idea remains that somewhere built of memory and dust, there still stands a city called Babylon, the first dream of civilization, and the last one we never stop rebuilding.